People have described the experience in many different ways over time. That experience of realizing the oneness, the interconnectedness that is part of human existence and beyond. Some say it happened the first time they hiked to the top of a mountain. Some when they fell in love or made love for the first time. Some when they see particular works of art. And some say it happens through music. One of my first experiences of it was in August of 1988, when the Reverend Jean Southard invited me to go with her and a couple of other people to the 25th anniversary march on the March on Washington, I stood in a crowd of more than 50,000 other people and had a deep sense that I was part of something much bigger and much more vast than I had ever known. Never before had I realized to the same extent that it wasn't just about God and me. Standing in the midst of so many people who shared the dream of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I had my first glimpse of the Spirit of God that we talk about on Pentecost, the Spirit of God that empowers people and then sends them out. It was also my first experience of the inescapable web of mutuality that Dr. King preached. This moment in my life took years to understand and integrate. Like many of you, I had been taught that my main concern should be for my own personal salvation and how many other people I could share the news with who could also be saved. I had been taught that my own personal actions were what mattered, that each day was like a scorecard with good marks and bad marks, and my goal was to make it through the day without the bad marks. At some point along the way, I was also taught to love my neighbor, but it was put in the category of good marks instead of bad marks. There wasn't much mystery to any of it. And the way that thinking happens, it did all revolve around me. Some of you have shared similar teachings in your own backgrounds. It wasn't until I began having experiences on other continents and with other people and the natural world that demonstrated how much bigger everything was than just me, that I began to realize how limited the idea of a personal God really is. Do you remember the first time you saw the ocean, if you have seen the ocean? Or if you live here in Chicago, the first time you saw Lake Michigan? Were you overwhelmed by how large it was and how you'd never be able to see or understand or know the whole thing? I still have the experience of the vastness of the world and God and this deep sense of mystery and even a little fear every time I look at and stand near the ocean. When I became a mom for the first time, I remember having a similar experience. I was overwhelmed by emotion and cried for hours through that first night. Yes, some people would say it was the hormones, and I'm sure that played a part. But it was also a sense of the connection that I had never known before. I was overwhelmed by the pain and the joy all intermingling together in what I knew would be a connection that would never be broken. When we think of ourselves as individuals, separate from other individuals and all other life forms and living things, we are missing the point of this life. And we center ourselves, which then influences the ways we live. When you do a search in the Bible for passages about interconnectedness, maybe some of you have done that, you won't find much. Every time we read Scripture as though it's all about individuals, we're missing the point of the stories. Last week we talked about our creation stories, our origin stories, and how our lives have been impacted by the emphasis on individual human creation as the ultimate and most superior of all creation. That emphasis has led to human supremacy, which allows for us to be disconnected from all other life forms, as well as each other, ourselves, and God. Fortunately, the Apostle Paul gave us this great image of a body for understanding interconnectedness. It doesn't require much explanation because it says it so simply. There is no part of the body that is expendable. Notice Paul didn't mention the appendix. Paul is not being literal, though. The body is being used as a metaphor for the church that Paul is mentoring. In the way they are living as interconnected community, Paul is telling them that there's no such thing as an individual. It's the whole thing working and living together that counts. From our perspective, so many years later, we can also understand the body as a metaphor for the created world, including the parts we don't and can't see or know. Each part needs the other parts. Each part impacts the other parts. Isn't that what interconnectedness is about? The pandemic is one of the best examples we have for how interconnected we are as a world. And yet it has brought out the worst parts of individualism and this illusion that we are separate from each other. We instantly became suspicious of every other human. In the beginning, here in the US, people went on buying sprees and purchased more than what they needed in order to ensure that they and their family would have more than enough, without thinking that it might mean someone else might not have enough. We hunkered down in our own spaces alone, or with a partner, or with a beloved pet, and some have stayed hunkered down for more than a year. Some created pods with a couple of other people who could be trusted. Because of our privilege, many of us were not physically going into work. And then if we were to venture out to exercise or go to the grocery store or run an errand, do you remember how alert you felt and maybe are still feeling? Literally all of your senses were engaged in alertness, constantly looking for those who might infect us. While the entire world was suffering from the same virus, we here in the US were focused on which states were locking down, which states were requiring masks, and which states were not. It almost became a kind of contest or competition to see who was refusing to take precautions and who became the sickest according to the numbers. We paid attention. Overnight, seemingly, it was a bit like Lord of the Flies, where the fittest survive, which in this case meant who could get their hands on PPE and respirators for hospitals the fastest. And then came the race for the vaccines. How many of us in the midst of this have wept for Brazil? Or how many of us have wept for India? We've been through a very difficult period of time in which we have been self-focused on survival. We've lost our sense of global community because of our own desire to stay well. In the blink of an eye, some of us went from being activists who advocated for open borders and an end to exclusion based on race or religion to agreeing with those calling for the closing of our borders. Self-protection. For some, the pandemic will have been an experience that was a bringing together. And for others, for many others, it will be an experience of having become self-focused and feeling separate from all those around us and wanting and insisting on separation. At times like these, we remember that our call is to connection. Our call is to interconnectedness, not just between us and other humans, but between us and all other living things. Many of us remember when chaos theory brought us the notion of the butterfly effect. The idea that if a butterfly flaps its wings in one part of the world, it can change the weather patterns in other parts of the world. The idea was that each of our actions across all species has effects that are more profound than we have realized. This was also one of the more significant revelations of physics, that all components of matter are interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent. While this kind of interconnection can be terrifying, it can also be comforting. We are literally never alone in this world. While we may feel separate or excluded at times, it is an impossibility according to chaos theory and physics and philosophy and spirituality. The more sobering part is that each action has a reaction, and that means we're responsible for more than just ourselves. We're responsible for more than just our own family's toilet paper. Last week I mentioned Bayo Akumulafe and the meaning of the term he coined, withness. We talked about learning the language of withness, which means we don't stand outside of or separate from things or people and witness to those things, but we are a part of everything, and therefore we are witnesses. Today we're learning the language of interconnectedness, or interbeing, which is a term that Thich Nhat Hanh created. As a doctrine, interbeing is the idea that all phenomena are interconnected. It means that no phenomenon has independent existence. Whatever is comes into existence because of factors and conditions created by other things. When factors and conditions no longer support that existence, then that thing ceases to exist. To illustrate this concept, I want to tell a story that Bayo tells in a webinar he's done on making sanctuary. He refers to himself as a recovering psychologist, and he tells this story from Psychology News about a study done on something called epistemic situationism, which you don't need to know that part of it. It's just a big term. The study was done because we think we ourselves, each of us a self, each of us separate selves. He describes how in capitalism, each unit is a separate unit, independent of other units, and not related to context. Epistemic situationism suggests there's no such thing as an independent self unrelated to context. So, and this is where it gets interesting, a team of researchers studied judges in the federal court system. Bio asks the audience to consider, and so I ask you to consider, what are 3 characteristics of a good judge? When the audience answered on the webinar, it was things like being fair, not bringing prejudgment into a case, being a good listener, bringing wisdom and experience like elders do. These are some things we would say we value and look for in federal judges. In other words, we look for individuals to possess these particular traits, which reinforces the idea that we're individual units in a capitalistic society. But the study of judges, in the study of judges, psychologists found that there are predispositions that exist that impact the outcome of cases. They were able to narrow it down, and eventually, you're going to love this. This is the climax right here. Eventually, they discovered that they could predict whether a judge would dismiss a case or agree to hear a case based on the hardness of the furniture on which they were sitting. Literally, the quality of the furniture that the judge was sitting on was determinative. They realized that judges were more likely to see something that was hard and rigid if they were sitting in something that was hard and rigid, and they were more likely to see something as fluid if they were sitting in something softer or that had some kind of soft fabric on it, or something more like a sofa. This means that federal judges are interconnected to furniture in ways that they are most likely not conscious of, that influence their decisions. We have made personality or character traits central, when the reality is that we are constantly being shaped by our context in ways that we don't even notice. Why is this important? As we learn the language of interconnectedness, or interbeing, I love that term that Thich Nhat Hanh created, we definitely play a role as humans, but we are not the only ones in the picture. If we're going to be able to become more conscious, we have to reframe the notion that we are separate beings, that humans are somehow superior. Who knew the furniture has been deciding cases in federal courts? And we need to embrace with curiosity this expansive notion of our interconnectedness. If we leave here today thinking it's just the experience of or knowledge of interconnectedness or interbeing that's important, we've missed the point. Learning the language of interconnectedness or interbeing is about decentering our human experience and seeking to learn from the many energy sources, the life forms, the things that are all around us that we don't yet know, and the experience of the sacred or divine. Instead of a personal God, which is just me and God, we begin to relate to God and experience God in all of creation. This means, in part, that instead of craning our necks to look to the heavens, to find and to see God, we're going to give our necks a break. Not a real break, just give them a metaphorical break. And begin to look all around us. Imagine how differently we would think about gun violence if we were to take seriously our interbeing, our interconnectedness. When we center ourselves and the human experience, we think of gun violence as a problem that, if we don't solve, might eventually impact us. Here in Chicago, one of the arguments used to get people who live on the North Side to care about or be concerned about gun violence is by using the argument of how we too could become victims, that crime can easily make its way north. Drives me crazy. Interconnectedness has nothing to do with whether or not I personally or you personally might become a victim. It has everything to do with the good of the whole. What kind of community, human and non-human, are we trying to create? One of the reasons we have a proliferation of guns in the US is because we center humans. And we center individuals. If we're focused on my safety or on your safety or my pleasure or your pleasure in being able to shoot a gun or hunt in any way, if we center that, then we can make as strong an argument for gun ownership as we can for banning guns altogether. If instead we're focused on creating a community of interdependence, collaboration, cooperation, mutuality, and thriving, we are going to approach gun violence very differently. We have many examples of tribes, of villages, of spiritual communities who have and who are practicing interconnectedness. We don't have to create anything new, but we will have to reframe our current thinking. We will have to redefine success. We'll have to come up with different models for problem solving and goals for living. By transitioning from a personal God to God of the universe, we don't have to worry about losing anything. Instead, we will be gaining something that is so vast and so deep, we are sure to be awed. Imagine walking through life with all of your senses engaged, maybe even all 99, and being able to experience God's presence in more ways than you even ever imagined. Amen.